all right. It's time for the Country 5-Minute Rant. So the Country Rant today is about, finally, someone is held accountable in Washington. Chaos! Scrolling across social media and cable news yesterday morning, one would think the sky is falling. At the Wall Street Journal, Republicans cut off their own heads is the editorial headline with, "They now have the chaos they wanted," an admonishment. Indeed, Chris Christie, appearing on Squawk Box yesterday morning, said, "What must President Zelensky be thinking about this as he wakes up this morning?" As if any American should care what the authoritarian leader thinks about American politics. The New York Post headline called it a coup by Representative, quote, "Gates of Hell," end quote. Despite all of these schoolmarms clinging righteously to arbitrary rules, and who are so easily scared out of their pants by a bit of uncertainty, it is true that the Speaker has never been ousted by Congress. A Speaker has never been ousted by Congress? Really? There's never been one bad enough to oust? At the same time, former Speaker McCarthy and the leaders in Congress are just as culpable, in fact, one could argue more so, for the unprecedented challenges we now face as Americans than the president they love to blame for all of it. And whether the Speaker is the right person, it is high time someone was held accountable for the complete malfeasance of government currently displayed in Washington. If you are so shocked by the move, and you've collapsed in consternation upon hearing the news, let's review a few other things that have never happened before and which the Speaker was elected to solve. The first, Congress has not passed a single appropriations bill before the October 1st deadline. October 1st is the beginning of the fiscal year. They need to pass their appropriations budgets for the next fiscal year. They haven't met that deadline since 2019, including zero this year. That's right, they have not passed one single appropriations bill in a year's worth of work. The Speaker took the gavel the beginning of January, promised to do this, didn't do it. And you have to understand how Washington works. When they don't pass these appropriations bills, and everyone is forced to do these continuing resolutions and these omnibus packages, guess who gets to pick out what's in the entirety of those bills? The Speaker does. That's why no one in leadership wants to pass an appropriations bill, because they're not in charge of the appropriations bill. The various committees are. It's about power, influence, and paying off lobbyists. Okay, number two, the national debt is $33 trillion and a staggering 120% of GDP. Every member of Congress, current and past, is wholly responsible. Third, the annual deficit for this past fiscal year is expected to eclipse $2 trillion, the highest ever, except for the first COVID pandemic year, which was a disaster. I think it was $4 trillion. And the CBO projects that the deficit will continue to be at least $2 trillion each year for the next decade. So if you're worried about $33 trillion in debt, the deficit over the next decade will add $20 trillion more to it. And McCarthy, is both the minority leader for years and years and then Speaker, presided over this profligacy. Fourth, there has been no vote in Congress for a balanced budget amendment, which the Speaker promised when he took the gavel. Fifth, the continuing resolution that recently passed and was cheered by many locked in that $2 trillion plus level of deficit spending. And by the way, added more. And guess what? When they do it in November again, they're going to add more. Sixth, inflation continues at historic highs. The average family spends $700 more per month on basic goods and services than they did 2 years ago. Now, the rate of inflation has come down, or the rate of change, but inflation increases accumulate. And as long as the number is positive, it adds on to the previous number. I think the total accumulation of inflation so far since Biden took office and since the Speaker took office is something like 18%. But again, it's $700 more per month on basic goods and services than 2 years ago. Sixth, there were 2.7 million encounters of illegal aliens at the southern border in fiscal year 2022. And it will likely top 3 million in fiscal year 2023. Now, keep in mind, that's encounters. That's who we know, who we met, who we found. There's also a huge number of what they now call gotaways. And of course, nobody knows how many they are. You just have to estimate. So at least 3 million people in this past year, and some quantity more than that. A vast majority of those folks are released directly into the United States. I just saw a story where a guy was apprehended, and here's your trial date for asylum. It's in 2025. 7, we've spent $113 billion on Ukraine aid. What's that bought us? 500,000 dead and a stalemate in trenches with no end in sight. There is absolutely no plan to win this thing. There's no plan to exit, even from a funding perspective. And there is no plan to figure out when we stop funding this and Europe and Ukraine pick up the slack. It's a useless, awful waste of money. 8, healthcare costs continue to skyrocket with family premiums. So the amount you pay for your insurance each month for the average American has moved from 11% of annual income in 1999 to 24% 3 years ago. That's the latest figure I could find. I'm sure it's more than that now. In fact, you may not know this because your employer pays your healthcare premiums, but I guarantee you your premium is the most expensive thing you pay for monthly. Go look into it. 8, Congress, despite promises to the contrary, continues to fund speech regimes at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies that engage with big tech to demand censorship of citizen speech. 9th, no one has been held accountable at the FDA or within the government, anywhere in the government, for lying to doctors that opioids like OxyContin are non-addictive. The opioid crisis continues unabated. 9th, no one has been held accountable at the CDC or otherwise for lying to the American people about the risks of the COVID vaccine. 10th, no one has been accountable at NIH or NIAID for funding gain-of-function research that likely created the COVID virus and that escaped the lab in Wuhan, and then covering up both of those facts. 11, for that matter, only one U.S. banker, whom no one has ever heard of, has been held accountable in government or the private sector for the fraudulent selling of synthetic and high-risk securities that caused the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. Would anyone honestly look at this list and think any person in leadership is doing well? Is the former speaker responsible for all of these crises? Of course he isn't. But has he done anything meaningful since taking the gavel to resolve any of those crises? I keep saying that wrong. Sorry. It doesn't appear so. It does not appear he's done anything. In fact, the speaker, whom Mike Allen at Political yesterday morning on Morning Joe called the darling of K Street, and that means that Mr. McCarthy is a bought and paid for agent of the lobbyists in Washington. K Street is where all the lobbyist firms are, right there next to the Capitol. If true, Mr. McCarthy had the most difficult job in the world, continuing to deliver sweetheart deals to corporations and other wealthy interests, or deliver for the people and his populist caucus in Congress. One can't do both. Additionally, Mr. McCarthy did himself no favors over the weekend in both daring Representative Gaetz to submit the motion to vacate and at the same time blaming Democrats for his problems, which reportedly convinced them to join Gaetz and the few others, I think there were 8 Republican Congress people, to oust the speaker in the vote. Indeed, the former speaker's hubris may be the defining characteristic of his speakership. He and his team have since ordered Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer to vacate their swanky offices in a final move of petty retribution. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Former Speaker, pride cometh before a fall. Finally, in terms of what happens next, those same school marms crying about the chaos are also in a panic for the future. One wonders if they have spent any time watching the UK Parliament, whose prime minister is much more accountable to his fellow members of parliament and changes regularly when the job is not done. I think there was a year, either last year or the year before, there were 3 prime ministers in 1 year. So maybe we'll have 3 speakers this next year. I don't know. If they don't get the job done, knock them down. Who's up next? Go. You don't get it done? Knock them down. Who's up next? The world does not end and the sky does not fall based upon a speakership. Next week, somebody, could be Steve Scalise, if he's healthy enough, Tom Emmers, who I accidentally called Jim in my article. Now I'm hearing maybe it's Jim Jordan, will likely become the next speaker. I suspect the Republicans, in a show of unity, will take this week between votes, decide and vote the new speaker in quickly. At that time, our school marms can move on to cry foul about other window dressings they hold sacred, while the new speaker, we pray, gets to the work on the 14 issues listed previously. The Republic has rarely counted on one man or woman, and Kevin McCarthy never fit that bill. He was never destined for Mount Rushmore. Let's be honest. It is my sincere hope that his loss is a new trend of accountability in Washington. If it is not, expect more firings by the people in 2024. Well, that was a 5-minute rant from the country. If you like that, please join us at www.thecountry.news, thecountry.news. You can also find us on YouTube, Rumble, and Twitter, where we're at JW The Country. See ya!